better roll them dice. You never know if it could change your life. Take a chance, you're neither wrong or right. You never know if you don't roll them dice. You better roll them dice.
All right.
Happy holidays to all of our listeners.
Merry Christmas, Rob.
Merry Christmas. The war on Christmas has been lost, Matt. And the SJW's won. You have to say happy holidays or season's greetings to me. Otherwise, the police will take you away and put you in anti-Christmas re-education camps. So anyway. But yeah, it is the holiday season.
Is there a role-playing game there? The War on Christmas, the RPG? Maybe a war game,
there
obviously.
Really ought to be. I think one of Futurama's best running bits was that like Santa had become like a terrorizing like conquering robot, and they had like an episode on that every single season. That would be a great setting for a War on Christmas campaign. Is something wacky.
He's coming, Rob. Are you ready?
Are you ready?
Just imagining like a World War I style propaganda poster
with a shadowy Santa in the background.
Yes, yeah. He's got his list. Have you made your preparations?
Oh man, Calvin and Hobbes made this observation 20 years ago, but he take it out of context. Santa sounds like the surveillance state. The elf on the shelf is just a natural extension of what Santa has always been, which is just a horrifying, omnipresent surveillance system that makes sure that children behave and submit to the whims of capital.
Yeah, well, okay. Well, you could make a fun monster out of Santa Claus, that's sort of evil Santa Claus that's coming. Like, I mean, I know I've seen like a Krampus or whatever in a homebrew monster manual, but an evil Santa Claus would be perfect.
Have you seen that Finnish movie Strange Cargo?
No, it sounds like a girl in the spider tattoo or something like that.
Hang on. Rare Exports, sorry, is what it's called. It's this hilarious
Rare Exports, tungsten, cadmium.
It's this just bizarre Finnish movie where these two like reindeer herders get like find like they uncover like an evil Santa, and he's got like a bunch of evil elves in it. It's truly incredible.
That's actually like a great spot for a Santa Claus. Other than like he's attacking your village and everyone needs to hole up because he's, I don't know, dropping like evil animated object toys down the chimney. That actually is to just make a dungeon in the North Pole.
Sorry, Matt. You're also describing the plot to another great horror movie just called Krampus, starring what's his face. It's got Adam Scott in it. That's what I'm thinking of from
Adam Scott
from Parks and Rec. Anyway, but there are like evil toys and like
I would have thought of like a William Dafoe type as a good Krampus.
No, the Krampus
has that sort of weird face.
The Krampus is a giant monster. He's just like an enormous like animatronic beast. But like there are like evil toys that they have to fight, and like it is very much like a dungeon. Like they're in their like big house, but like he keeps like dropping like evil Jack-in-the-Boxes down the hallway and things like that. It's too bad we're at the end of the year. Let's table this for next year. Create a Krampus or a Santa dungeon of some sort. Anyway.
Yeah, we should have thought of doing that. Anyway, hello.
Hello. This is
Santa Dungeon TBD.
Yeah. This is Dungeon Master of None. I am Rob.
I'm Matt. And today we're here to talk to you about...
Well, we're going to talk to you about something a lot less entertaining than Krampus. Not entertaining. A lot less lighthearted than the holidays and the war on Christmas and Krampus. We're going to talk to you about racism and fantasy. We talked about this a lot.
No one, we just want to say up front is that obviously coming from our position that no one is better qualified than Rob and I.
Right.
Two very white
important disclaimer that we are
people.
Two white guys and obviously the best people to talk about this. But as your longtime listeners are aware, this comes up a lot, and there are some very weird vestiges of overt and not so overt racism, sometimes more overt than should be, especially recently. And we like to push back against that, but we wanted to address it more directly, and we got the opportunity to do this both from a listener letter, which we'll read, and also a relatively recent an article by Paul Sturdivant of the Public Medievalist, great magazine and great follow, by the way, about race in the fantasy genre. So we wanted to take an opportunity to address it directly.
If you want to do your background reading before the discussion, the link to the article is in the description to the podcast. But I think as we've mentioned before, I think we've mentioned sort of two things, right? Is that one, fantasy sort of has in its sort of building blocks based on the trajectory it went in. It didn't have to be this way, but in the 20th century, the sort of fantasy genre had race in its building blocks.
Right.
And then two, we've talked about this before, most fantasy role-playing games do a pretty bad job of discussing race.
So yeah, as Matt alludes to, it's sort of in the DNA of fantasy as a genre, but and this is a broader problem, but there's a tendency among fantasy writers and players to say that, race is like a political thing, and we want to keep politics out of our games, and so, this isn't racism, this isn't like really the conversation we should be having as fantasy authors, fantasy developers, RPG writers, etc., which is, as I think people are starting to realize, not true.
Well, anyone who is saying keep politics out of whatever is, right, as I think we've said on this show before, inherently supporting a status quo or some other reactionary idea.
Correct. And that's becoming...
And if you look at the people who are saying it, it's almost always like quasi-alt-right people.
Yeah, and it's...
Dark Enlightenment, incels, whatever the newest flavor is.
You gotta call them Dork Enlightenment. And it's...
They hate that.
And that's correct and obvious, and I think more people are, like I said, people are coming to realize that, but for... I don't know, decades, it was the status quo that you could just, keep politics out of whatever.
Since we're talking about the fantasy genre, which most D&D games take place in something inspired by the fantasy genre, what are its roots? Should we start with Wizard of Oz, right?
Yeah, well, okay, so we should be clear that... this is a good question. It's reductionist to just... put like Tolkien as the starting point for everything, but that's sort of the...
Okay, good. Let's do that.
Well, let's do that. Well, so I want to do that, but also I liked what you said, starting with with Oz, and also I like to talk about Howard and
Burroughs, maybe
Burroughs and some of the earlier...
That's a little more sci-fi.
Earlier influences. It's part of the same impetus, I think. But when we're talking about race, I think we have to start by talking about Tolkien, because while Howard and Burroughs and all them are very much definitely racist, and also as the fantasy genre comes to sort of like merge into sort of like a speculative fiction genre, obviously Lovecraft is a huge influence, and he is also explicitly racist. But what we're going to talk about today, mostly about like sort of the RPG depiction of races, stems, I think, almost like one-to-one without any sort of difficult trail to follow from Tolkien.
But I feel like most people's reading of Tolkien is like, well, this is a really long book with a lot of unnecessary poetry thrown in that a lot of people hold or cherish very dearly, that was made into 3 or maybe 2.5 exciting movies by a bunch of New Zealanders. And they tend to love this book, or love its adaptation, or love its quasi-Christian overtones or something like that.
Right, and I don't
think most people even think about race with this.
Sure.
And that's probably a very white Christian perspective.
It is, and I'm a big...
I'm playing a Melkor's advocate.
No, and I'm glad you brought it up, because I don't think that Tolkien set out to be racist. I don't think that he was also especially racist for his time. And what I want to talk about...
He was born in South Africa.
That's like I think he deserves kudos for not being more racist. And I want to talk about...
Okay, all right, here we go. Official Dungeon Master done kudos for Tolkien. You could have been even more racist.
I mean, I'm just saying. But I do want to talk about a couple things that show some sort of small bits of Tolkien canon that show interesting nuance on his approach to race. But let's sort of like break down what the real issue here. So regardless of whether or not Tolkien, looked at all the non-white people living in London or abroad and said these are inferior to me,
right,
there is a sort of like a basic assumption in his books that there are scientific biological differences between hobbits and men and elves and orcs and whoever, right? And we sort of like take that in fantasy as a given, but there is something inherently problematic about the idea that your racial background actually like makes you better at sneaking, or hobbits are not inclined toward magic or whatever, and this seems very harmless.
Or if you're like a human whose one of your ancestors was an elf, you're I don't know, better.
You're going to live 200 years longer, and, you're destined to be king. And yeah, the more you think about it, the like less good it gets. But it seems relatively harmless when you're reading like the prologue to Lord of the Rings, and Tolkien says something like, "But hobbits have never, in fact, studied magic of any kind, and their elusiveness is due solely to a professional skill that heredity and practice and a close friendship with the earth have rendered inimitable by bigger and clumsier races." Right? That doesn't sound like,
okay.
No. It doesn't sound like any,
Sounds adorable.
It sounds adorable. It doesn't sound like race science. Doesn't sound like phrenology. But what happens if every or large chunks of the genre that follows takes that sort of general idea that there is a difference, there's an actual like biological, scientific difference between races, sort of as gospel? What sort of follows from that is sort of like what the problem is now.
So to me, it seems like, at least from the perspective of the early 21st century, where unlike in Tolkien's day, for example, we know that we shared the early couple tens of thousands of years of life on this actual planet in real history, not fantasy, with several other subspecies of Homo sapiens, right? Homo florenzinis, the Floresians. We shared life with the Floresians, who were like the size of hobbits, right? Archaeologists nicknamed them hobbits when they dug them up, and they were a different subspecies, right?
Right.
And today, we know that sort of the way we use race as opposed to species is a completely different thing, right?
Right.
Race is sort of socially constructed judgments about phenotypical and cultural traits that we've ascribed to large groups of people that have nothing to do with their actual genetic relationship.
Right. Oh, and we should really have laid this out at the beginning. If you're a longtime listener, you'll know this, but race, as it has come to be in the 21st century, is entirely socially constructed. It has absolutely no basis in any sort of fundamental biological differences between different types of people. But again, that is a given that is provable. If you don't agree, you need to do more reading. But that's sort of like, that's an important thing to know going forward.
And I would add that, like, even if it wasn't, right, it's still a terrible and harmful way of classifying human people, right? We could also make that as a moral judgment,
sure.
Right?
Yeah, so it's wrong and it's also bad.
Right. A long way of saying wrong and bad.
Yeah. Like many of the things that we complain about, they're not just incorrect, but also actively damaging and harmful to people. So again, I don't believe that Tolkien had any nefarious motives in mind when he laid out this sort of way of conceiving of fantasy people. And so a couple of the interesting things about this is there are also like actual non-white people in Tolkien, the Easterlings,
the Haradrim, the Easterlings,
and there's a moment,
the weird people who live in like Fornost,
right,
or whatever the ice place is,
and we don't get a lot of like insight into these. And I always thought this was sort of like an interesting, unexplored part of Tolkien's mythology. But there is an interesting moment in Return of the King when Faramir comes across, and Faramir, my boy, doesn't get enough love in the movies. Done wrong by Peter Jackson. Changed his character entirely.
Yeah, he really didn't he?
He sorry to go. I'm going to go from like a teeny little tangent, but in the books he says, if I found the one ring lying on the side of the road, I would not pick it up. He was one of the few like truly like honorable, good, strong men of the West, and they rewrote his character because they thought it would confuse the audience. Anyway, so he has a moment. I believe it's Faramir. It may have been somebody else and attributed to him in the movies, but he comes across the corpse of an Easterling or a Haradrim, and he talks about. He goes into like a little like thing about war, and in the movie he ends with war will make corpses of us all, which is I think Tolkien had like a because of his time in World War I and because of his, how many people he had lost, had like a pretty good understanding of, the general humanity and how war makes all young men suffer. And this is men, sorry. We'll do another. Tolkien's sexism is another issue entirely, but I do think he was like subtly or at least somewhat aware of the general real life racism. Right. And
here's a quote from the Two Towers. This is when Sam is walking over before Faramir says that line. It was Sam's first view of a battle of men against men, and he did not like it much. He was glad that he could not see the dead face. He wondered what the man's name was and where he came from, and if he was really evil of heart, or what lies or threats had led him on the long march from his home, and if he would rather have stayed there in peace.
That's what I'm thinking of. I think they added some of this to Faramir's speaking lines in the movie, which is what I'm mixing up. But anyway, I remember that moment from the book, and I do think it shows sort of a pretty decent understanding for a white upper class British man of the horrors of war.
And now I'm going to read Sam's poem about an Oliphant. Tall as a house, gray as a mouse. Okay, no.
He also, so another interesting thing about Tolkien's racism is that, he made orcs, unquestionably evil. There are speaking orcs, sorry. There are no good orcs. There are no valuable orcs. They're all evil.
More orcs have speaking roles than Haradrim or Easterlings.
That's right.
So.
That's right. I forget. And yeah, but they're unquestionably evil by root. Right. And in the his original conception, they're corrupted and twisted elves. But later in life, Tolkien began to worry about their souls, right? He started to wonder, well, if they're
God, it must be really difficult to be Catholic. Sorry to all of our Catholic listeners.
It must be very difficult. But he also started wondering.
Hey, but it's an interesting opportunity for y'all. You get to think about life on other planets and how quickly can we get Jesuits there?
I'm sorry. Anyway, so to his credit, he started to wonder, oh, well, what does this mean for their souls? Like, how can they be uniquely evil? And he started to like sort of rethink and said, actually, they're twisted birds and beasts, not elves, though this never made it into any of his writing. He wrote this in a letter late in his life. Right. Let's get away from Tolkien, because there's we've already a lot like talked about the issue, which is sort of like laying down as canonically true a scientific racism, which is and
the one last thing I wanted to bring up for Tolkien is something that Dr. Paul Sturvat, the person whose article you've hopefully skimmed through while listening to this by now, which is that Tolkien combines two things into this concept of that he calls race, that you might call in a sci-fi RPG a species, which is sort of cultural traits and maybe like biological abilities, right? And I don't want anyone listening to think that Rob and I are against you having in a fantasy game a species for players that one can see in the dark or see heat vision and the other can't. Right. I'm not saying there's something wrong with that.
Yeah, and as we the games that we play, I don't think that there's. Again, I don't think you're being racist by picking an elf, and that's not what we're saying.
Why this is important is, like, for example, if you look at 5th edition D&D, and really any edition D&D, you'll find something like the dwarf. Like, if you look at the dwarf's characteristics, their traits, right? They're hardy, right? Their constitution is increased, right? So that we could imagine is from their sort of physiological traits. They have dark vision, also from physiological traits. But they also have things like stone cunning, tool proficiency, and dwarven combat training, which come from being raised in a very specific society, right? And those are two different things, but they're lumped together in one. And that's one other thing that Paul points out that I want to bring up, that Tolkien gave us in the beginning.
And yeah, I do want to talk about sort of like different conceptions of race and species and ancestry at the end. Dwarves is an interesting point. Yeah, because there's these built-in assumptions about what they're good at regardless of where they come from or what. Yeah, it's let's just go ahead and skip to D&D, because D&D is the real like crux of this, because everything there springs from that.
I mean, and we're staying more or less chronological here, because, you know, D&D is only a decade or so after the high point of Tolkien popularity.
I think this, one of the reasons why I think this is important is that we, after spending the better part of my life online, I realized that I think a lot of people, especially in nerd spaces, are more influenced by the way that the world is presented in games and in fantasy properties than they let on. And this part of the reason why I believe this is after spending a lot of time on Reddit answering questions about history that are clearly derived from Crusader Kings 2. I think that like a lot of nerds especially get their idea of the past from games and increasingly fantasy properties. And I'll talk a bit about this with Game of Thrones towards the end, but
okay, that'll be a good closing thought. Well, that is insane and frightening to think about.
I hope that I'm wrong, and we'll see. But I just think that people like see an idea of the past and then just don't examine it. And if your main exposure to the past is sort of like a fantasy past, then you may end up thinking that, oh, actually, race is a real thing, even if you're not like consciously doing that. So what becomes an issue, so we've talked about Lord of the Rings, and then obviously Gygax and crew were heavily influenced by Lord of the Rings in creating the first editions of Dungeons and Dragons, and they codified numerically the differences between dwarves and elves and hobbits or halflings and etc. in terms of racial ability scores, right? So dwarves are tough, but also hard-spoken, so they get +1 to Constitution, -1 to Charisma in first edition.
Right, that was first edition things. Right, 5th edition, I think, thankfully got rid of the ability penalties, or ability maximums if you go way back.
These differences have become softened, but even in 5th edition, you know, I want to talk. I think for the most part, it's gotten a lot better, and a lot of like things like stone cunning and wood lore and whatever that are just sort of like built-in assumptions about what a race is good at have fallen away. Though there's still plenty of that. That being said, for some reason, orcs and half-orcs are still like assumed to be a sort of like savage species, which is interesting, and I have pushed back and complained about for as long as I've been playing. In 5th edition they have ferocity and do more damage on critical hits. So even if you're an orc wizard or half-orc wizard, you still, you know, are apparently the kind of half-orc wizard who will bounce back up from being, you know, knocked to 0 hit points because you're inherently, you know, anyway. But generally, this is improved. But the point... Sorry, I went all the way out of the way. But we were talking about how the issue here is that stats were or the differences between races were made numerically significant, right? They take the scientific racism of Tolkien to the next level.
Let's dive into D&D. I think, right, that is the sort of the core problem that D&D lifted from sort of Tolkien's ill-conceived description of these different fantasy species as races. And I think one thing that you know, Rob and I know, and that this article that we're referencing points out, but maybe some of our listeners don't know is that the myths and the legends, right? Because fantasy role-playing games also draw on myths and legends and folklore in addition to just fantasy stories from the past 70 years. In those sort of stories, the idea of race doesn't really exist in the same way, right?
Right.
There are Norse tales about elves and humans, but the elves aren't called a race, right?
Right, and if you, and this, well,
I mean, I guess you could, like, the Mayans talked about, like, different types of people, but they were talking about, like, different ages of the world.
Correct. This is something that you should all know, but, like, the modern conception of race is not found, it is purely a modern convention. Like, you know, before the early modern era, if you had tried to divide people in this particular way, it would not have made sense. Ancient peoples and pre-modern peoples were certainly aware of, like, different types of persons, but they would not have conceived of races. They would have thought of people from different parts of the world, or even different towns or countries or nations, empires, but
religions.
Yeah, but they would not have been able to conceive of different races as we understand them. And so
the point is, like, if an ancient Greek or Roman was reading a myth about the story of humans and centaurs, and the centaurs dragging away people, they wouldn't think of the centaurs as another race, right?
And similarly, and this is important, when the Norse wrote about elves or about trolls or whatever, they weren't thinking of them as different races. Those were fantastical creatures that were, you know, from, in some cases, a different world, or, servants of the gods or something like that. They would not have thought of them as human-like creatures, but with, you know, different racial traits. And so I think as Matt is alluding to, when Gygax and crew start casting a little further afield to find the material for Dungeons and Dragons, that's when things get a little more problematic. And so the core of this article, again, great article about race in Dungeons and Dragons, is, of course, the drow. And
let's talk about the drow.
Let's talk about the drow. This is a good point. I don't really, like, center drow very heavily in any of my games. I don't think they're particularly interesting. I have very rarely played in a game that had much drow, but as I was reading this, I was like, oh, right, this is really terrible. This is just like, these are black-skinned elves, and in, like, the canonical lore, they are evil. They're like hilariously evil. In case you're not aware, they
just love doing evil all the time.
They do. In case you're not aware of, like, the Forgotten Realms drow, they're matriarchal torture society that worships a demon spider queen, and, like, condemns prisoners to, like, the demon web pits. I mean, they're just like mustache twirlingly, cannibalistically evil, and other worlds. So in Eberron, they're not in. I don't know if they're even in Dark Sun or anything else, but but in the core game, they are all, with one notable exception, very, very, very evil.
Right. One interesting thing about the drow in the PHB is that they're the only thing in there that I'm aware of where it specifically says, the line in the text, ask your drow adventurers are rare. Ask your dungeon master if you can be one. And it's like, whoa, that's the only thing presented in there that's like, ooh, maybe you shouldn't have these in the game unless the dungeon master lets you. And I think what I assume is the reason for that is because they're one of these evil races, right? And 5th edition for the orcs or the drow sort of explains it as evil divine influence. Drow are under the control of Lolth, orcs under Grumash, and it's like his divine or her divine power is so influential, it's enough to cause every single member of a race to be evil.
Correct.
It doesn't exactly explain why every elf isn't good or something like that.
Right. So yeah, Matt makes a great point here, and I'm sorry for dragging us into a side conversation, but not only are drow specifically called out as maybe not so much for player character, but also they have stat blocks in the monster manual, and they're very frequently depicted as villains. In Dungeons and Dragons, in the main setting, in Faerun and the Forgotten Realms, there is a race of dark-skinned elves that are unquestionably evil. And if you can't see sort of the issue there, then don't know what to say, to be honest. And it's weird that I don't think about this much. I don't use them much in my games because aside from the weird racism, I don't think they're very interesting. But it is strange that 44 years after the creation of Dungeons and Dragons that we still have this like bizarre, if not like explicitly racist, like very like poorly thought out. And D&D has made radical changes to the world. Like they have all these, Forgotten Realms has all these like in-game events like the Sundering and the Spell Plague and the Time of Troubles. So maybe we can have one of those that makes the drow not evil or not black. I don't know. Just a thought, wizards. Something to consider. Yeah. Maybe use some of your earned capital with the player base to I don't know, do something about those dark-skinned elves.
Well, so I think here's a good approach that I think most DMs who are reasonable would take in their own homebrew type games. Like if you have a set of creatures, right, whether they're drow, elves, dwarves, kobolds, goblins, orcs that are not sort of outsiders or supernatural creatures like fae or devils or demons that are sentient, right? Mm-hmm. Those creatures probably run the gamut of alignments and abilities and things like that for one reason or another. For example, they're, goblins may have airships or they may all live underground, right? And this could be through accidents of history, but not because of their inherent alignment, right?
Right. And so this is just like basic historical stuff too, right? Like one of the problems that we constantly talk about is a general misunderstanding of how easy it was for people to move around and how many different types of people appeared around the world. I spoke recently about some Wampanoag Indians who ended up fighting in, the Ottoman Wars in the late 17th century. They
got shipped to Marseille and as like galley slaves, right?
Yeah, something like that. And then they fought, in as far east as Constantinople. And I'm not saying that there were like a lot of American Indians in Europe, but it's just sort of an example of like in the real world, which doesn't have teleportation or magical ships or and has all these like restrictions that we in real life placed on people. There's no reason in your fantasy game for a race of any sort to be limited or all come from the same society unless you have a really, really, really good reason for that, right? There's no reason to think that every dwarf is good at stone cutting and that every elf is like a forest child.
Okay, so to bring things around and hopefully get somewhere with this conversation is that, Tolkien gave us sort of some very weird ideas about race. He was very insistent on using that word. Other fantasy authors that were influential on D&D, explicitly racist, Burroughs and Howard, talked a lot about sort of different different racial groups, and things like that. Dungeons & Dragons, as it stands today, still uses the word race to describe different, species or subspecies of intelligent creatures, whether they're humans, elves, or dwarfs.
Right.
So where should we go? Are we saying it's a bad thing to have those in the game, to have elves and dwarves and tieflings in your game?
I personally don't think this is a huge problem. I don't think that most players are getting bad ideas about race. I think most modern players of games are well educated enough or capable of educating themselves enough to approach this as the way that it should be approached. I do think that it is a better idea in the long term and better for the game and just more interesting to remove a lot of the built-in numerical differences between races and get away from the idea of race in general. But I don't think that if we continue as we're going that there's anything that, we don't have to throw the whole game away, as they say. We can do better.
Here are some ways forward. I think the first, most obvious and easiest one that could be fixed in a subsequent printing of this edition, right? One that can be implemented tomorrow, is to use a different term than race, right? Race has a specific connotation in the modern world that is completely inescapable. Plenty of other games, some published by Wizards of the Coast, use this same sort of concept of choosing your ancestry. They use the word species. I remember the Star Wars D20 book used species, not race, and it meant the same thing. Numerically, it was the same effect, whether you're a Wookiee or a human, right?
Right.
So that's one straightforward thing they can do.
And we have praised Pathfinder's new edition for doing this. I think that they call different races, they call them ancestries. And personally, I think this is an elegant and about as good a solution as you're going to get, as long as you continue to have dwarves and elves and goblins and whatever.
Naming wise, I think it's a great solution. Mechanically, I think their character creation stuff is all fucked up, and I'm not super excited about second edition. But naming wise, it's super great.
Yeah, and again, the great things we're still very early on, and I hold a lot of hope for subsequent changes to the second edition rules. But in terms of inclusiveness and in terms of being aware of the inherent pitfalls racially in terms of gender of Dungeons and Dragons or role-playing games, I think that Paizo and Pathfinder do a really good job. But yeah, so calling it ancestry is a great way to sidestep the issue to begin with.
Right. And then I think one mechanical change, and this was actually suggested back in the third edition Unearthed Arcana book, is that you could separate sort of inherent traits like dark vision from cultural traits like dwarven weapon training or stone cunning. So that, for example, if you had a dwarf raised in human lands, right, and they didn't get a chance to learn the things that are common traits practiced in the dwarf home caves of stone cunning, they would instead just get a skill proficiency or an extra language or something like that. So you could separate those two. And I think that's a good thing to do in principle.
I think so too. I think that if you're going to continue to have inherent traits, your stat boosts and dark vision, that's okay. Especially if you then have sort of a separate part of character creation or a separate part of your background that covers or make background cover more of that stuff rather than that being part of your racial makeup.
This is a huge pet peeve of mine for like third-party campaigns that build on the D&D or D20 like substructure that that only have humans in them, but then substitute some of the racial stat boosts from other races to sort of differentiate different types of humans. I remember there was a really interesting D&D thing called Northern Crown that was for third edition, and it was set in the sort of New World American Revolution, and you could be from fantasy Spain or fantasy England or something like that, but it was like basically picking between elves and dwarves and stuff like that. I'm like, wait, they're all supposed to be human. Don't do this.
Yeah, don't do that. I also think that nothing truly of value. All right, here's I got two things here. Well, here's my one.
Sound like hot takes. Let's go.
Here's my one thing: is that you don't have to have elves and dwarves in your games. You don't have to have elves and dwarves in fantasy. Period. There are other ways to make distinct characters and distinct types of games without relying on these particular racial tropes, right? I am not encouraging D&D players to play games where they do not have dwarves and elves. I find dwarves and elves and orcs lots of fun, but if you don't need it, that's okay, and it's a great way to avoid all of this weirdness if you just have humans, or maybe you just have all elves or something like that. That's okay. The second thing that I'm going to say is that they're not particularly hot takes, but that you can smooth over a lot of the differences and make them a lot more subtle and still keep a lot of the interesting differences between all these fantasy races. They don't need to be like quite so differentiated, especially as Matt and I have talked about with regards to sort of their culture. And
one of my least favorite things about 5th edition is all of the sub races.
Yes,
right.
Correct.
I didn't like them before. They sort of were brought back into the game, and I think they suck.
Yeah. The first thing I do whenever I'm building a homebrew world is I actually usually, if I'm running a D&D game, I keep dwarves and elves and orcs and everything, but I completely rewrite their backgrounds and try to imagine them as, a people group rather than a race of whatever. And they keep a lot of the same things, but I try to... I don't know, folks. Just you don't have to have Scottish dwarves, and you don't have to have forest elves, and I just don't.
Here's what I did last character creation I had for a 5th edition game was basically take all the sub race traits, put them in a lineup, and based on balance and things like that, I said to players, pick some of these, right? So if you're an elf, you could pick the various things, right? If you want to be a smart, if you liked the wood elf fleet, but you also wanted a +1 to intelligence, right? Instead of wisdom, you could pick those two things,
sure.
Right?
Yeah, and I think that in general, and also with an eye to like how biology actually works, is that having your stats actually based on your upbringing and where you grew up and what sort of like influences you had in your character's childhood makes a lot more sense than being born strong or being born hardy, and a system that allows you to reflect that would be interesting and avoid a lot of this race stuff. It makes a lot more sense in a non-D&D setting, but the point is that there are other ways to do this that are not weirdly that don't involve calipers and skull measurements.
So that's mechanically how to fix things. How can we make things better, sort of storytelling, world building wise, lore wise?
Sure. Well, Faerun and Forgotten Realms is a lost cause. They'd have to rewrite a lot of it. Again, thanks to, we forgot to mention this at the beginning, but thanks to Sally for writing in and asking us about this a few months ago. But the core setting is weirdly Orientalist and ethnocentric. They still have a not Africa and a not Asia, and against all odds, an entire drow, underground, dark-skinned elf society. But if you are...
Easiest stuff is don't write your setting in a default Europe, don't put around it sort of exoticized versions of the rest of the world. Make sure that when you describe all types of people, regardless of their species, that they have a broad range of phenotypical expressions, right?
Yeah, and it's you can have a not Europe as your campaign, and that's okay. We don't like that. I think it's boring, but nothing is stopping you from doing that. But just sort of be aware that real life is more complicated than traditional fantasy has portrayed it, and provide opportunities for non-white people or non-white societies to be portrayed as equals, or as frankly as just existing, and compared to your main society, and just be aware of sort of these pitfalls. I think just thinking about it is a good way to, when you're homebrewing or working on your own campaign, or even running an existing campaign, of all the things that have not been properly addressed in the RPG community until recently.
I think people default to a not Europe is because of the way our education of history, which right fantasy tends to draw on, they can easily understand, well, this place is not England and this place is not Scotland, and I can understand the relationship between those two and France. But, you can always use more modern things, right? Make one of your fantasy medieval duchies not California, and the other one not Louisiana, and the last one not Canada, right?
Right.
There are plenty of things that people can relate to, right?
Mm-hmm. And this does take a little bit
In
more...
this fantasy duchy, they have deep dish pizza. In this one, they have the square pizza they cook on pans. And it's Detroit versus Chicago.
Right. And it does take a little bit more work, and there's a certain comfort in sticking to familiar things. You know, the Not Europe has taverns and horses and roads, and, you know, they fight with armor and swords, and they don't have guns, and it's all like very familiar if you're used to playing in a fantasy setting. But you can pick up sort of the general idea of, you know, what a medieval, you know, Tang Dynasty China or something in Nahuatl society. And again, be careful about setting, you know, your game in a non-Europe location and then weirdly exoticizing it. But you can draw on that and just sort of like use that as a starting point without needing to like know everything. And that allows you to be creative. And, you know, there's no reason why there can't be taverns and horses and all the familiar things, except it just so happens to be in not Europe. Or you can just sort of like mix it all together, and, you know, you don't have to rely on existing cultures. Get wacky. This is, I think, one thing that a lot of people are afraid to do, but feel free to be take some liberties with your cultures. One property that falls prey to sort of the scientific racism of Tolkien is but does interesting things with it is Dragon Age. Dragon Age has your, you know, men and elves and dwarves, also possibly for no reason, but they do, and yet there's some very, very interesting deviations within that setting as to their what they're about.
For someone who's not familiar, give me an example.
Well, sure. So the dwarves live underground, right? Typically. But they have sort of a highly structured, because they're constantly at war with the Darkspawn, they have a highly structured like honor society, and this doesn't sound all that different from dwarves, but they're not like wow, they're not like mining.
Dwarves love honor.
They're not like mining, you know, merchant gruff drinkers. There's like a bunch of like organized crime. Anyway, it's hard for me to actually like put into words because it's a lot
organized crime. This is a good point here. If you don't know what to make like a fantasy species like dwarves or something, just make them a Southern Italian.
That's right. It's never,
pizza pie. Just make the dwarves from Monopoly.
You can always make fun of Italians. It's never racist. Anyway,
gabagool.
Obviously dwarves, but they're not Tolkien dwarves. And again, this is an imperfect example because Dragon Age is very much like race-based, but it's an example of how you can stick to those familiar things without having to do exactly the same thing over and over again. Matt, did you have some ideas on culturally what to do differently, or in terms of depiction?
Well, I'm going to just, since we've been referencing this article so much by Paul B. Stewart-Vaughant, I just wanted to give him one of the final words, which he says in his article. So if you create fantasy worlds, join in. Insist that people of color and non-European cultures are a vibrant and equal part of your invented world. If you want to keep the elf, dwarf, human, hobbit, orc lineup that Tolkien established, understand what it means to do so. Perhaps you could even use the paradigm to critique or deconstruct the racist structures of previous fantasy works. Whatever you do, you could work to subvert and dismantle the racist structures that are a deep part of this genre. And I think by what he's saying there is that if you're not trying to, if you don't try and at least consciously think about this as you create your world or as you tell your story with your players, you're sort of really adding to the problem, right? If you're not working on defeating the problem, you're making it worse, which maybe is not exactly what Paul is saying, but it's what I'm saying.
Yeah, and I actually loved what he said there, and I've been trying to be gentle and to say, you can do whatever you want because I want everybody to have fun and be a part of the part of the community, and I want to be inclusive, and I don't want anyone to feel like driven away. But what Paul said is more correct than what I said, and I should have been firmer, because the truth is, if you're going to create your own worlds, you should challenge yourself to be better, and you should do very much what he said and try to think about think about the past and think about the future and work to try to critique or deconstruct, like you said, the structures of previous fantasy works. And I find this fun and interesting. I think once you like let go of your preconceptions of how things should be or should work, you can have a lot of fun with the game and with how you depict people and races. And I think that if you're going to create in, the year of our Lord, 2018, 2019, a new fantasy property or come up with your own homebrew world, that you should challenge yourself to do more, to be more interesting.
Yeah. And you can do this on several different levels, right? You can do this on the campaign or world building level, but you can also encourage your players to be part of it on the individual level, right? Obviously, as we've talked many times on this show, there's a sort of a problem of the like one good member of a weird race or one person that doesn't fit the mold, but that still is an opportunity for your players to engage in a critique of some of these structures.
And I think that if you're patient about this and if you present this in the right way, and in your enthusiasm for this re-examination or for looking at things in a new way if you present that to your players and they can see it, then I think that they'll be on board with what you're trying to do. And you can tell a new and interesting stories, which is really, I think, what this is really about, and what is most exciting to me, in addition to dismantling, the racist superstructure, is just, telling better stories.
Okay, Rob, to close us out, I wrote down earlier on my notes, ideas from fantasy properties. You said to remind you, I don't remember what it means.
Well, I think I wanted to talk about this other article from the Public Medievalist, but we kind of closed out that area. We've talked in the past about other works to read, and I think we're probably going to be rehashing some old ground, but we might as well do it again to talk about things that you can draw from that are good. So Matt and I have discussed at length The Throne of the Crescent Moon by Saladin Ahmed, which is a terrific fantasy book and one of probably the pinnacle of the D&D adventuring party turned novel genre. And it takes place in a medieval Arab world, and it is explicitly like not racist and a fully realized culture and tremendously interesting. So if you just want to be exposed to something that's culturally different, that's a terrific one. I have like 5 of these, Matt. So do you want to jump in with one before I go next?
Well, I was just going to say, like, it also presents opportunities for using things like species or ancestry in a new light. For example, you could imagine where in a society that reveres nature or something, that once every year a special child is born with the powers of the shifter race or the Asimar traits or something, and they're considered blessed by the gods or by nature or something like that. They're not exactly their own species. It gives players the opportunity to use those mechanical things if they want them, and some great role-playing opportunities that aren't about that stuff. Another example that I can think of is just what do you think about Shadowrun's handling of the same Tolkien elf, dwarf, and orc thing? So in Shadowrun, a wave of like magic rolls over the world that mutates people into these specific races or causes new children to be born into new species of elves or humans.
Imperfect, but better, and also better because it takes place in the modern world. It does a better job of modeling the actual racism of people in the modern world being racist. It's awkward because if you're racist against an orc in Shadowrun, that's different than being racist against a black person, because an orc is actually like biologically and statistically distinct from a human. But Shadowrun does, I think, a better job of being upfront and like making fewer assumptions. And unlike D&D, I think it has evolved to meet the times better. Still not perfect, but an interesting way of dealing with that particular thorny issue.
They've definitely spent more time evolving to meet the times on working on the fact that they didn't predict that wireless was going to exist, wireless communication.
Took them a bit for sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
Longer than it should have, to be honest.
That's okay. We're not all seers of the future.
Right.
Okay. Do you have any other examples of good fantasy to draw on?
Yeah, one of there's of course N.K. Jemisin's Broken Earth trilogy, which is being made into a TV series at TNT. This is mentioned in Paul Sturdivant's article, and it's there are no. Well, actually, that's not true. There's race is approached very interestingly because N.K. Jemisin is a black woman and writes explicitly black characters with black skin and black hair, and it's dealt with substantially better than in any other fantasy property that I'm aware of. And it's mostly humans. With a couple of interesting exceptions, but it's worth reading sort of to get ideas of how a fantasy world can exist and acknowledge and be aware of race without being racist.
I was just thinking of Game of Thrones is probably going to. Do you think perhaps imagine, if you will, Rob, that we've left a turning of the age has happened. And that we've left the age where Lord of the Rings was the touchstone for every nerd thinking about fantasy. And for the next 50 years, it's going to be Game of Thrones, the wildly popular TV show, and the books if they're ever finished. And while they do have elves, except they're also like hobbits and druids.
Right.
And they do have giants. They do have other sapient species. The book is entirely about humans, and the humans do seem, George R. R. Martin gets a lot of things right about some medieval things, but like the humans do seem like a little more aware of race than I feel like a medieval person would
I didn't
be.
get to talk about this much, but this is one of the things that was talked about in this other public medievalist article, and we'll link it as well. Just as sort of like supplementary reading. If you're coming here for homework, you came to the right place, because we're going to give it to you. But it talks about how George R. R. Martin, how there are non-white people. The Dornish are not white. The Dothraki. There's people from
Summer Islands,
but. And I wasn't aware of this, but there are actually no viewpoint characters that are not Westerosi until like the fourth book or something like that. I think actually not counting Melisandre, who is white. And the show does a little bit of a better job of this, but Daenerys is explicitly a white savior, and the Dothraki are sort of exoticized, and again, it's not like super weird or bad.
I just don't understand why the Dothraki in the show wouldn't wear armor. Armor's so useful.
I know.
Why don't they wear it?
I know.
Into battle.
And the Mongols wore armor. They just wore
armor's. They wore great armor.
They wore great armor. Some of them had like very powerful like lamellar armor, like heavy like samurai type
and
armor,
like an coat of silk and all this shit.
Anyway. They would not have gone shirtless for sure. They would have worn at least leather. Anyway, whatever.
The Mongols would have saw people going shirtless into battle and laughed at them and filled them full of arrows.
They were incredibly practical people. Anyway,
as all people are, we should point out.
As most people are. But the reason why they conquered half the world is because they were very realistic about how to do that, and that meant wearing armor. Sorry, that was a great point, Matt.
It's just bugging me. Yeah, so I think maybe we're gonna get another, and this is what I could be afraid of in the future is like taking these various human groups, Westerosi, Dornish, Dothraki, and making them into something that defines your like fantasy game as opposed to just defines your character's background.
Right, and I feel like there are more voices in the conversation than there ever have been before, and so I don't know that we're ever going to get whatever our next cycle of fantasy influence is. I don't think it will ever be as dominated by one property, as
one ring,
as it were. But I do think that there's a through line in like the most popular types of fantasy shows and genres, and there's definitely an adherence to or an excitement about gritty, violent, sexy realists, maybe sort of grimdark type shows. It seems like, and I don't think that many of the others besides Game of Thrones are going to see as much success, but I wouldn't be surprised if sort of like the base assumption becomes something Game of Thrones like, for when people are like, oh, I haven't really thought about this part of my world. Oh, they're Dothraki, or, oh, there's some, there's a race of ancient forest people, rather than there are dwarves and elves or whatever.
Well, one thing, and this is completely off topic, but I was thinking back to, I wonder if this would be worse or better. I was thinking back to Tolkien, and it seems like Tolkien himself was unclear about, for example, whether you could recognize at first glance if someone was human or elf or orc, right? For example, if they were wearing a helmet, right? Tolkien talks like, oh, if you saw this elf move, you would know they were an elf, but you couldn't recognize them. And, that is, I think, also an interesting approach you could take to try and critique this in your game. And, for example, especially if you're playing a game where the gods or divine things have a heavy influence, maybe your patron deity that chooses you determines whether you are a wood elf or a high elf or whatnot, right?
So we've talked before about sacred cows, and this is one of those sacred cows, right? Race is a thing in D&D that has such like momentum and importance to the player base and legacy within the system that it is difficult or impossible to change. Some of these have, again, sacred cows culturally insensitive? Maybe I shouldn't say that.
Maybe a little bit.
Well, another one of these is paladins being exclusively lawful good, which, by the way, we did finally get changed because it just doesn't really make any sense.
And it was fine, by the way.
It was fine. Also, another one was iterative attacks. Also gone and fine. And yeah. I don't know that...
Well, 4th edition got rid of iterative attacks.
Oh, that's right. That was even done before.
Earlier. Yeah.
But I don't know that
they also got rid of the one alignment paladins. So
was that 4th
good
edition?
job, 4th.
Yeah, way to go, 4th edition.
4th edition, breaking new ground while
we did not
failing terribly.
We did not enjoy 4th edition, but I respect a lot of the things they tried to do.
Sir, I did not enjoy you, but I will play to the death to defend your right to have made things. Okay.
Well, let me finish this thought, is that I think for now, again, it doesn't matter. It's not a big problem. But in the future, I could definitely see, maybe D&D 6th edition or 7th edition not having races except as sort of a more like visual or cultural or much more minor part of your character's background or overall package. I could see races being phased out or becoming much less significant down the road.
I think Rob's dreaming too big here, probably. Right? I think you're not going to... This is what I feel like I can reasonably hope for, which is something that, honestly, I think you could homebrew in today, which is to stop using the term race, just use the term species, or if they use some other word, that's fine too. This picks whether you're an elf, a dwarf, or a human. This gives you some minor things, right? Dwarves get dark vision, elves move faster or something like that. This is both mechanically interesting from a tactical point of view, and players are not going to be able to move past that sort of trope that they've held on to forever. But to take everything else from races and move it into an extended background section. Backgrounds had a chance to be really cool and define a lot of things, but they're kind of blah right now. They just provide you with, 2 skills and some languages. But if they could provide you with things like, a single cantrip if you're raised in a highly magical society like the High Elves, or stone cutting if you lived in an underground place, or a weapon training in something if you lived in a society where there was a high percentage of warriors, something like that. Anyway, so I think, and this is where you can put in things like, oh, I'm a noble. Oh, backgrounds already do this, but you can really enforce it with things that give you stuff you can write on your character sheet. So that's my hope.
I agree, and I think that's realistic. And Matt's probably correct, the most that we can hope for.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't think we're ever going to get away from stat boosts to different species either. I think
probably.
not.
Again, we could do away with it. Nothing would happen, but that's okay. That's fine.
Yeah,
whatever.
It would be fine. Okay. Any other closing thoughts?
Nope. We'll probably keep coming back to this, and there's a lot more to talk about with all of it. It's an ongoing conversation, and what makes me happy is that we are having the conversation. It is not one that was very much brought up or addressed until very, very recently, and I think that when I say we, I mean like the D&D community, fantasy fans in general are doing a much better job of addressing this issue. And
no one is asking anyone to do anything other than to think critically about this, use your damn brains, and to listen to people and creators who are not white. And their opinions about this, right? That's all anyone is ever asking you to do. No one's trying to take your game away from you. And
we're not trying to do that. You don't have to feel bad. You don't have to, you're not a bad person. Nobody's trying to nobody's going to take your games away. We're just asking you to just think about it. Just think about it.
So that was Dungeon Master of None.
It's
over forever now.
This is it. It's the last episode. If you are angry at us or have thoughts or want to, ask a question, please, as always, email us at DM of None. Add us on Twitter at DM of None. Rate, review, subscribe,
keep rolling the dice.
Them dice. That's right.
Since I came to know you, baby, I've been telling you how